Several sessions ago, we introduced the concept of a covenant, a binding commitment between two parties. Now, we noted that the majority of the Old Testament follows the unfolding of one key covenant between God and the people of Israel, a covenant that was first mediated by Moses at Mount Sinai. When that covenant was made, it included stipulations or requirements for how the Israelites were supposed to behave, a list of things that they agreed to do in obedience to God. According to the terms of the Sinai covenant, if Israel followed all of these requirements, God would bless them and protect them. If they failed to obey, God would withdraw the blessing and disaster would follow. The set of requirements that the Israelites agreed to are what is called the law. Their details make up a large portion of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In total, by Jewish count, there are 613 specific stipulations that Israel is required to follow in order to remain in good standing with God. Some of these requirements are clearly moral. Don't commit adultery, and honor your parents, and don't mistreat the immigrants who live among you. Other stipulations are clearly religious, like don't make any idols or images of God. But there are also laws for managing skin diseases and cleansing from mold, laws for disciplining children and for dealing with accidental killings, for foods to avoid, and even for how to wear your hair. A large section of laws specifically governed when and how to sacrifice animals if you wanted God's forgiveness. The Old Testament law covers so much broad territory because it was actually serving several purposes at once. It is a religious text, yes, but it also served ancient Israel as a health code and as a national constitution. All of these various functions of the law are not very clearly distinguished in a way that might seem sensible to us, because biblical Israel was not just a nation like any other nation. It was designed as a theocracy, a kingdom operating in all of its facets directly under the rule of God. A significant portion of the Old Testament is made up of prophetic texts. You might think of a prophet as a covenant auditor. His or her role was to keep the Israelites updated on the state of their agreement with God. If the Israelites were failing in some way to live up to the terms of their commitment, it was the prophet's job to speak for God and say, hey, everybody, you seem to have forgotten a few crucial points of our covenant together. Things are going to go quite badly for you if you don't wake up and adjust your course. We often think about prophets as people who predict the future. And biblical prophets do indeed often have supernatural insights into the future. But the prophets are not fortune tellers. Most of the time, the work of the biblical prophets is to carefully attend to the voice of God and understand the link between actions and consequences. They tell people what lies a few miles down the road if they continue on their current trajectory. The reason a prophet can't simply predict the future is that the future might well change, depending on what the people do next. God is responsive. When people change directions, either for better or for worse, God adjusts God's response. The prophets simply point out where the current course is leading, and they suggest what people can do differently if they want to see a different outcome. Jesus had an interesting and rather complex relationship with the Old Testament law. In one of his most famous sermons, Jesus takes a set of requirements found in the Old Testament, and he says, "You've heard it was said in the law, Do not murder. But I say to you, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister is in danger of judgment. You've heard it was said in the law, anyone who wants a divorce must follow fair procedures. But I tell you, don't divorce at all. You've heard it was said in the law, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. In other words, don't escalate and do something worse than what the other person did to you. But I say to you, if anyone tries to take your shirt, give them your coat as well. One of the things that perplexed people interacting with Jesus is that he didn't treat all the requirements of the law in exactly the same way. Some requirements, like those related to eating or ritual purification, Jesus didn't seem that concerned to enforce. Other requirements Jesus made exponentially harder. After all, it's much easier not to murder than not to get angry. And divorce in Jesus' day was widely practiced, making his stance on marriage quite strict. Where the law said, love your neighbors, which was commonly interpreted as meaning other Jews, other people like you, Jesus said, love your enemies. And don't even get people started on all the reasons it would be crazy to love the vile, oppressive Romans. Jesus himself says this about his relationship to the Old Testament law. He says, don't even begin to think that I've come to do away with the law and the prophets. I haven't come to do away with them, but to fulfill them. To fulfill the law is to bring it to its appointed purpose, to the end that it was intended for. But what exactly does this mean? Later on in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus talks more explicitly about the lens that he's using to interpret and apply the Old Testament. Someone comes to Jesus and asks him, which of the 613 requirements of the law is the most important? And Jesus answers by quoting a command from Deuteronomy. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment, according to Jesus. And no one would have been surprised at this answer. It was widely accepted among Jewish teachers that love for God was the center of the law. What was surprising was that Jesus kept on talking. The second is like it. You must love your neighbor as you love yourself. This insight was uniquely Jesus's. These two commands of loving God and loving neighbor are actually one. They're intertwined in such a way that it's impossible to do the former without doing the latter. But Jesus goes even further when he says, all the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. What Jesus is arguing is that those 613 Old Testament requirements were really just specific ways of directing us toward these essential points. If you've loved God and neighbor, the law has been kept in every way that matters. And if you've kept the letter of the law, but you failed to love, you've missed the main point and accomplished nothing. This interpretive principle of love is the logic behind Jesus' approach to specific laws. Jesus' teachings based on the interpretive principle of love were more demanding than the law, precisely by remaining more open-ended. The Old Testament command to love your neighbor wasn't meant to tell you who you didn't have to care for. It was meant to start you down a road toward recognizing even your enemy as a neighbor. The law that once told people to give away 10% of their earnings, Jesus now teaches to consider everything God's. The law required that people not lie under oath, Love required that people present themselves truthfully. Jesus told the common people who gathered to listen to him teach and interpret the Bible, "Come to me, and I will give you rest. My yoke is easy to bear, and my burden is light." This term, yoke, that Jesus uses is a common metaphor for the weight of the law. What Jesus is suggesting is that moving from 613 commands down to 2 is a considerably lighter load to carry. If you want to know what God requires, the answer is never more or less than love. The challenge is figuring out in any given situation what love actually looks like. And Jesus often found himself in hot water in relation to one particular set of laws, Sabbath laws, which governed what you were allowed to do on Saturdays, the Jewish day of worship. The law stated in Exodus 35, "Do your work for 6 days, but the 7th day should be holy to you, a Sabbath, complete rest for the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath will be put to death." You can see why the Sabbath requirements would be taken seriously by faithful people. So why did Jesus so often seem to chafe against them? Well, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' disciples are picking grain to eat and get called out for working on the Sabbath. And Jesus observes that in dire circumstances, no less an Old Testament hero than King David once ate bread that the law said no one but a priest could eat. And Jesus' point is not that the rules don't matter because David broke them first. His point is that the purpose of protecting the bread was so that priests had something to eat. In some circumstances, like David's, breaking the law's letter could honor its spirit of feeding people in need. As Jesus put it, Sabbath was created for humans. Humans weren't created for the Sabbath. So how is Jesus reading the Old Testament law here? Well, if we go back to the Old Testament and we look at the origin of the Sabbath requirements, one of the things we might notice is that these requirements were given to newly freed slaves whose backs were being broken by endless labor. For them, Sabbath laws weren't a burden, but an assurance of their freedom. They would never be slaves again. One day every week, they would rest and recover and play and worship. But the Sabbath laws were also strict for another reason. The Israelites were not permitted to make their servants or resident foreigners or even their animals labor on Saturday. Because God had not rescued them so they could do to others what had once been done to them. The Sabbath laws protected vulnerable populations from becoming just a cog in Israel's economic machine. When Jesus says that the Sabbath laws were made for humans, he's pointing to the context, the history, that makes the law's intentions plain. The point of these laws was to drive home the value of life and to help people live in freedom. This is why Jesus' disciples, hungry and far from home, can pick some grain to eat. Their actions are perfectly consistent with the law's intent of valuing life. Jesus reminds religious people not to miss the forest for the trees. When we read the Old Testament law, just as when we read all parts of the Bible, the most important question we ask is, what does Jesus have to do with it? We consider which instructions Jesus picked up and reiterated, either directly or in modified form. One example is the practice of Jubilee. According to the law in Leviticus, every 50th year in Israel, the economic deck was supposed to be cleared. Land reverted back to its original owner. Debts were erased. The intent of these years of Jubilee was to ensure that inequity in the community was never entrenched in a way that created a permanent underclass among the people of God. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, in his first sermon, Jesus reads from the prophet Isaiah. "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." This statement appears to be a declaration of Jubilee. But Jesus is not simply declaring an occasional Jubilee year. He's declaring a new age of Jubilee economics. It seems clear that this is how Jesus' first followers heard him, because in the book of Acts, we find them sharing their possessions. We see the wealthy selling properties to care for the poor so that everyone has enough. When we read the Old Testament law, we ask what parts Jesus transformed or left behind. Jesus' comments on purity laws, for example, suggest that he believed people worried too much about their dirty hands and too little about their hearts. We can take cues from the book of Hebrews, which explores the way that Jesus transformed our relationship to the requirements of the sacrificial system. Jesus is the only priest we need and the only necessary sacrifice. Our aim when we read the Old Testament law as Christians is to allow the law to draw us toward Jesus and toward a deeper understanding of what he has accomplished. The requirements of the Old Testament are not the basis of the Christian relationship with God. But these laws can serve as a kind of bridge that carry us toward Jesus and toward his fuller revelation of what God requires. We allow Jesus to teach us how to read the law in light of its true intent. So all of this reflection on the law leads us to the prophets. We've said that the role of the biblical prophet was to serve as a kind of covenant auditor, keeping the people updated on how well they were doing with keeping the requirements of God. The covenant that the prophets enforce is not our covenant as Christians. But the prophets' goal of staying in step with God lead them to highlight a few key themes that span both testaments. One constant concern for the prophets was idolatry, worshiping other things in the place of the one true God. Archaeologists have found remnants of incense stands for Asherah, a prominent local goddess, set up next to the altar for Yahweh, the God of Israel. But it wasn't just putting up statues that were the problem. The Israelites also had a bad habit when they were scared of running to empires like Egypt, looking for protection from their massive armies, instead of trusting God for their security. Idolatry can be quite subtle. Jesus points out that money is one very popular idol. For practical purposes, you might think of an idol as a person, an object, or even an idea that you order your life around. It's the thing you run to when you're scared in hopes that it will save you. The Old Testament law prohibited the Israelites from even making an image or a statue of their own God. And this wasn't because they were against artistic expression. The concern was actually that it's far too easy to shape an image of God and then start to believe we have God all summed up. But the freedom and the mystery of God resists reduction. Making God too small, believing that you have God captured and contained. These too are forms of idolatry. The prophets are also famous for speaking boldly about the practice of justice among the community of God's people. God tells the people of Israel through the prophet Isaiah, "Isn't this the fast I choose? Releasing wicked restraints, untying the ropes of a yoke, setting free the mistreated and breaking every yoke? Isn't it sharing your bread with the hungry and bringing the homeless poor into your house, covering the naked when you see them, and not hiding from your own family? This particular concern of God for the needs of the poor and the vulnerable is just as visible in Jesus' teachings as it is in the law and the prophets. In fact, Jesus' own revolutionary statement that love for God and love for neighbor are one and the same is exactly what Isaiah is speaking about. Centuries before Jesus, the prophets who were listening to God were already telling Israel that there was no way to honor God while neglecting the battered bodies of their neighbors. When Jesus says, "Whatever you do for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you've done for me," Jesus is speaking recognizably with the voice of the God of Isaiah. When considering how the teachings of the biblical prophets apply today, keep in mind that the vast majority of the prophets' exhortations were concerned with how the Israelites, the people of faith, the people of God, should conduct their lives together justly and faithfully. The contemporary equivalent of Old Testament ancient Israel is not the United States or any other nation, but the church. The call of the biblical prophets and the call of Jesus was first and foremost a call for a new community that stands out as a radical alternative to all the nations of the world. The citizens of this new kingdom live by a new way of peace and a new definition of power that are only truly possible among those who've willingly submitted to Jesus as Lord. In both the Old and New Testament, there is no true answer to the problem of justice that doesn't also require an answer to the problem of idolatry. But perhaps the most important theme that weaves its way through the biblical prophets is a simple message regarding God's love. Jesus was not the first to proclaim the relentless love of God. According to the prophets, God is pursuing Israel tirelessly. God's commitment does not lag or stumble when Israel's does. God's compassion is not exhausted by all of Israel's failures. God's faithfulness is not conditioned by the people's faithfulness. Even the judgments of God, when God's judgment does fall, it is itself an act of mercy and deliverance. God's judgment is God's power exercised to break chains, right wrongs, and level the ground so that all people can walk together in joy and in freedom.